Roger Berkowitz, and I'm very happy to be here. This is the final meeting of our virtual reading group on the origins of totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. I should say we'll continue to meet as a reading group for those who would like. We'll read other books, and at the end of this talk, I hope we can discuss what we might read next. The book began, we should recall, way back 460 pages or more before where we are now, with a preface. And in that preface, we spent a fair bit of time talking about this line about the last line of the first paragraph, right? Where she says, under the most diverse conditions and disparate circumstances, we watch the development of the same phenomena: homelessness on an unprecedented scale, rootlessness to an unprecedented depth. It's not an accident now that in the end of this book, we come back to those same ideas: homelessness, rootlessness, superfluousness, and loneliness. So this last chapter, Ideology and Terror, which I've mentioned, was added only in the second edition of the book, has, I think, three parts. It's short, but it has three parts. The first part is on ideology. The second part is on terror. And then there's a last part, which is on loneliness. And so we need to talk about those three ideas. They are the three, I would say, core ideas, the three defining ideas of Arendt's understanding of the elements that go into totalitarianism. Those three core ideas are ideology, terror, and loneliness. So let's just take a quick look at a couple of passages from this chapter. The first one is on page 460 and 461. I've read this quote on 460 a number of times because it's such an important quote, and it's in the second paragraph of the chapter, where she writes at the very bottom of that paragraph, "It may even be that the true predicaments of our time will assume their authentic form, though not necessarily the cruelest, only when totalitarianism has become a thing of the past." And this is such an important line because it really does, I think, express where Arendt wants this book, how Arendt wants this book to be read, which is, on the one hand, it's an account of two versions of totalitarianism, but it's really an account of how those two versions of totalitarianism reflect what she will call the true predicaments of our time. And this chapter is on that. I think the true predicaments of our time are the three themes of this chapter: ideology, terror, and loneliness. And what she's saying here is that totalitarianism, on the one hand, was one expression of ideology, terror, and loneliness, but it could disappear. And yet these true predicaments can still emerge and take on their authentic form. And so we're not out of the woods, even if totalitarianism never comes back. The second very short passage I just want to point out to you is on 461. On 5 lines down and then about 7 lines down, she talks about the basic experience of our times, right? And she says, if there is a basic experience which finds its political expression in totalitarian domination, then in view of the novelty of the totalitarian form of government, this must be an experience which, for whatever reason, has never before served as the foundation of a body politic, and whose general mood never before has pervaded and directed the handling of public affairs. So I'm going to suggest to you that the basic experience that Arendt is talking about that underlies totalitarian domination is loneliness. And what she means by loneliness, she's going to express in the last 5 or 6 pages of this chapter, which are, I think, some of the most harrowing passages of prose ever written in the political world. I mean, I encourage you on a regular basis to go back and read these passages. They are harrowing and yet insightful. The discussion of ideology, which is what then is the first part of this chapter, is fascinating because she adds a dimension to it. She says on page 462 that the fundamental difference between the totalitarian and all other concepts of law comes to light. Totalitarianism can do without the consensus juris. So by the consensus juris, we mean the general consensus about law, that law is somewhat legitimate and should be implemented. And she says totalitarianism can do without this legitimacy, this consensus of law, consensus juris, because it promises to release the fulfillment of law from all action and will of man. And it promises justice on earth because it claims to make mankind itself the embodiment of the law. This is a new and extraordinary formulation. What she's going to say here is that what totalitarianism does is it, on the one hand, it passes laws and ignores them. It ignores laws. It ignores the consensus juris, but it imagines itself as the embodiment of law freed from human intervention. And so on page 463, she talks about how for the Nazis, race laws were an expression of the law of nature, right? That Aryans are above Jews and other races. And that at the bottom of Nazi ideology is a scientific, or she will call it a pseudoscientific belief that she names Darwin's belief, that man is a product of natural development, which does not necessarily stop with the present species of human beings, right? This is not a critique of, obviously, Darwin's thesis about the origin of the species. It is a critique, however, of his idea that man is a biological being and that man will be, that there's no moral center to man, and that he will in the end be superseded by other species. And that this is simply a scientific process. And she says that the Nazis embraced this Darwinist idea, and their philosophy is based on it. Similarly, the Bolsheviks, she says, their idea that class struggle and the eventual dictatorship of the proletariat is an expression of the law of history is based on Marx's notion of society as the product of a gigantic historical movement which races through, according to its own law of motion, to the end of historical times. And she says, while many people want to distinguish Marx and Darwin to the benefit of Marx and say Marx was not a racist and Darwin might have been, she wants to suggest that both Darwin and Marx, as she says here on page 463 to 464, both reflect the view of man as simply a plaything of higher laws, so that everything is justified by the justice of higher laws. So on the one hand, by Darwin, by this idea of the development of man, and by Marx, the unfolding of history. It all reflects, quote, a tremendous intellectual change. This is on 464. The refusal to view or accept anything as it is. And this is absolutely central to her understanding of totalitarianism and to our modern predicament. It is a refusal to accept or view anything as it is, and in the consistent interpretation of everything that is as being only a stage of some further development. So that law itself changes from being something real and stable to being something that brings about a scientifically generated expression of some higher purpose. So the argument here is that totalitarianism in both Germany and Stalinist Russia were movements grounded upon ideologies that were pseudoscientific expressions of this Marxist and Darwinist idea that made the law not something that was stable and just and real, but turned the law into a means to some purpose, a means to an end. And one of the most important thinkers in the legal world to express this idea is a German theorist named Rudolf von Jhering, who wrote a very famous book called Der Zweck im Recht. The law is translated as law as a means to an end. And the argument here is that law is no longer an expression of truth or justice, but it is simply a means to some end. And whatever end we set for it, that is what law will seek to achieve. Law becomes, as I've argued in another place, simply a scientifically justified means to an end. And law loses, and justice loses any meaning or substance and becomes simply a means to whatever end we set for it. And so in my book, The Gift of Science, Leibniz in the Modern Legal Tradition, this is actually the argument I make, is that the rise of a legal science turns law into simply a means to an end. And what Arendt is saying is, when we then add to that an ideological movement of pseudoscientific ideas, the law becomes a complete tool of that ideological movement. And this is what she thinks happened in both Germany and in Russia. So that's part one of this last chapter. Part two, which is on ideology, part one. Part two is on terror. And I'll be very brief about it. But basically, she says on page 465, terror is the realization of the law of movement. So if we have a law of movement, and law has become the expression of the movement, and it is an expression of a movement which is scientific and thus true, how do we express that movement in reality? Well, we have to make reality fit the ideology, the law. And the way we do that is through terror. And she says its chief aim is to make it possible for the force of nature or of history, so Darwinist forces of nature, Marxist force of history, to race freely through mankind, unhindered by any spontaneous human action. Terror, she says, is lawfulness. I mean, this is the shocking reversal that she now pulls. Terror is not lawlessness, it's lawfulness, but lawfulness in the sense of absolute conformity and fidelity to historical and racial laws that are superhuman. And since it is that, it must deny any human action that could show that these laws are not true. And thus it must deny all human freedom and all human spontaneity. And any time something that happens that is not in accord with the laws of nature or the laws of race, that either must be eradicated, and it even must be denied, and reality must be changed to fit the expression of the law of nature. And she makes this incredible comparison between totalitarianism and tyranny here, whereas tyranny, as bad as it is, still leaves some space for human freedom, because it just demands that you not oppose the government, whereas totalitarianism says you can't act in any way spontaneously or freely. And so she says, by pressing men against each other, this is on 466, total terror destroys the space between them. Compared to the condition with its iron band, even the desert of tyranny insofar it is still some kind of space, appears like a guarantee of freedom. One of the most remarkable sentences. When faced with the iron band of totalitarianism, tyranny actually seems like a space of freedom. The chapter ends with this last series of pages on loneliness, which is the basic experience of totalitarianism. Loneliness, she says on page 475, she says, loneliness is the common ground for terror, the essence of totalitarian government, and for ideology and logicality. So loneliness is the common ground that underlies both terror, which is the essence of totalitarian government, and ideology and logicality, which she says is the preparation for terror and for totalitarianism. So ideology and logicality are the preparation, and terror is the essence. And she says both of these are, quote, closely connected with uprootedness and superfluousness, which have been the curse of modern masses since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. On page 478, and this is the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to you guys, she writes, quote, what prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century. This, I think, is the ultimate conclusion and point of Arendt's now magisterial book, right? Loneliness, superfluousness, homelessness, these basic experiences of the masses. And by the masses, we don't mean the poor, right? That's an important point I want to keep coming back to. We mean all of those people in our society who are uprooted, homeless, and lonely. She talks about how loneliness used to be only a marginal phenomena in our society. Maybe the sick were lonely, the old were lonely, people who didn't have, their daily life. But it has moved from being a marginal to being a central component of man. Those of you who know the sociologists, I think David Reisman and others, he's one, and now Robert Putnam. I mean, the sort of sociological exploration of loneliness as a modern phenomena is fairly widespread and a popular motif. Arendt is not a sociologist, but she is. I think what these sociologists explore is similar and helps explain some of what Arendt has to mean. And so the basic argument, to put it in a nutshell, is that this experience of loneliness, uprootedness, superfluousness, homelessness makes men susceptible to the utter logicality of pseudo-truths and ideologies, makes them thus susceptible to the claim of absolute total domination, and thus prepares them for the experience of total domination and terror, which then seeks to remake the world according to ideologies and pseudo-truths. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are questions or comments that people have. I see a bunch of things thanking me, and I appreciate that. I'm glad that you've enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed it. It's been a great opportunity for me. You know, I teach this text regularly, but usually to students and in a different way. So it's been a great opportunity for me to hear comments of people who have a different perspective than undergraduates, which I really enjoy. Barry, you want to say something?
Yeah, let me, perhaps we want to discuss for a moment the difference between isolation and loneliness, as Arendt has it.
Okay, you want me to talk about that?
Sure.
Yeah. So Arendt makes a three-part distinction, right? Starting on well, in this discussion of loneliness. So on the one hand, she talks about loneliness. On the other hand, isolation, and the other hand, solitude. And so it's worth looking at all three. So she says, I can be isolated. This is the bottom of 474, Barry, and anyone else. I can be isolated. That is, in a situation in which I cannot act because there is nobody who will act with me without being lonely. And she says also about isolation. In isolation, man remains in contact with the world as the human artifice. Only when the most elementary forms of human creativity, which is the capacity to add something to one's own to the common world, is destroyed, isolation becomes altogether unbearable. This can happen in a world in which the chief values are dictated by labor, that is, where all human activities have been transformed into laboring. Under such conditions, only the sheer effort of labor, which is the effort to keep alive, is left, and the relationship with the world as a human artifice is broken. So, obviously, for those of you who've read The Human Condition, this will make more sense, I think, to those than to those who haven't. The isolation is for Arendt this idea, as she says, when you cannot act and when your connection with the humanly built world is broken.
Okay, Roger, I'd like to just say something at this point, if I may.
Yep.
It seems to me that isolation, in her terms, moves from one end of the spectrum to another. The isolated artist who can talk to, as she says, talk to himself or herself and relate to his or her work is hardly lonely in her terms. You may be isolated, but you're productive. You're at work. The other end of
well, can I respond to that briefly, Barry?
Sure.
Let's just and then you can respond. Yeah. So an artist is a good example, right? An artist for her is not lonely, even though they are in, I would say, not isolated really either. They're in what she calls solitude. Are you hearing?
Correct.
Do people hear me?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's exactly her point.
So an artist is in solitude insofar as they are not isolated. They're not isolated from the world, and they're not lonely and deserted by all human companionship. In fact, the artist is one who withdraws into solitude and engages in a conversation with the world, but free from the interference of the social world and from others,
right?
And thus is actually deeply engaged with the world.
Right. So that's the one end of the spectrum.
That's one end of the spectrum. The artist,
right. Other end
solitude.
Is the totalitarian one, or
yeah.
the tendency toward loneliness.
So isolation is something different. It's when you are, I can be isolated. I can live, to use a sort of a somewhat mundane example, I can live on a farm in the middle of Iowa, right, or wherever, and there's no one, and I don't have a political world that I can act in, but I can still, raise my family as I want, and I can still, appear. I can every once in a while, write an article or do something. I'm not lonely. I'm not fully cut off from the human world, and yet I'm isolated. I still have contact with the world as the human artifice, right? I still, as a farmer, I can still farm, I can do things, I even have freedom, I can act, but I can't act with others because I'm isolated. And so the sort of prototypical example of isolation is tyranny in her mind, right? Under a tyranny, you can sit in your home and drink bourbon with your friends and talk. You can curse Mussolini and you can curse Hitler. You can curse whoever you want. You can be an artist. You can paint. There's a lot of things you can do as an isolated person. What you can't do is get together with others and protest or act against the regime. And so isolation is a political experience where you're free in your private world and thus connected to the world, but not free to act politically.
Roger, may I just add one more thing at this point?
Yeah.
That is the question about secret police, which she made a big, and rightfully so, much of. If you're sitting at a home in a tyranny and you're terrified to speak, that's because you're afraid of being denounced, either by a friend or an associate or police. And then we have a tendency to move from tyranny into totalitarianism.
Well, that's exactly right, Barry. So the point here is that the secret police is not something that exists in a tyrannical state for her. It's something that exists in a totalitarian state, right? A totalitarian ruler, a tyrannical ruler for Arendt, and this is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, right? As bad as tyranny is, it's not the end of freedom. You can live under a dictator and live a very free life, but your freedom is private. It's not political. And as much as Arendt is a theorist of politics, and she believes deeply that politics is an essential part of human activity, she is anti-tyranny. But having lived through totalitarianism, her point is that tyranny is nothing compared to totalitarianism, and that there is a kind of freedom that exists in a tyrannical or fascist world that doesn't exist in a tyrannical world. And isolation is that political unfreedom, but it still allows for a connection with the world and freedom. Solitude is a different experience. It's the experience of being alone and in solitude, but still deeply connected to and thinking about the world, so that one talks with oneself, free from the interference of the social of conformity or pressures of conformity, and thus allows one to think originally and in new ways about the world, which is what artists for her do. And not just artists, poets, philosophers, thinkers, actors. But she thinks that solitude is the experience that underlies truly revolutionary and new action. Loneliness is where you can no longer talk to yourself, even solitude, because you have been so pressed together that even to have that kind of spark of freedom will lead the secret police or others to denounce you. And so you censor yourself and don't even have those conversations. You're so rootless and homeless and atomized and lonely that you need to believe in the truth and glory of the system, that you refuse to believe or think freely. And you see any free thought as itself a betrayal of your life and your meaning as part of the movement. And loneliness is also not isolation, because it's not that you're just isolated but free in your private life. It's that you are completely committed to a public embrace of the truth of the movement. And so she distinguishes these three things. Does that make sense, Barry? I'm happy to. These are complicated distinctions, but they're important for her, and they come back in a lot of her work.
I was just thinking about that scene in 1984, at the very beginning, when Winston tries to escape from the ever-viewing TV camera to his little desk, thinking he's moving from loneliness into solitude. I'm stretching a point, but I think that's where you find some kind of interesting contrast between the two. He's hoping
I think it's
it's a good thing, and therefore with himself at that particular point.
I think I've mentioned these two books. I mean, the two books that to me best give us examples of these three ideas of loneliness, isolation, and solitude are 1984 and Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. And so the scene in 1984 that Barry here is referencing, so Winston is there's a TV which not only do you watch but watches you, and he finds this little nook in his room where he can be free from the TV. He thinks it's not actually, and there's a sense in which in a tyranny, right, this would be a space of isolation as opposed to utter loneliness, and also a space of solitude where he can think. And
right.
It turns out they're watching him even there. And by the end of the book, he learns and he becomes convinced that he must fully believe in the truth of Ingsoc, English socialism. And he understands that having simply outward conformity and inward disobedience or inward dissent is not enough. You need to fully embrace and accept the truth of the movement. And that is what Arendt would call loneliness.
Roger?
Yes, Howard.
Yeah, I just want to bring this into contemporary times. It seems to me that, we certainly haven't gotten to what either Orwell or Arendt is talking about. We do have a situation where people don't talk not only about issues, but for example, where I live, we have a lot of very, I would call them people on the right, and there are some few on the left. And the people, they don't talk to each other because they can't talk in any meaningful way to each other. It ends up in a tantrum. And there are a lot of other things that are happening in our society that lead us to, talk to ourselves, but that's it. We're stuck in talking to ourselves. And the media doesn't help this conversation. So to me, what you said so far this afternoon is significant in looking at where we are and how we improve upon where we are or change where we are.
I think that's very well stated, and I appreciate it. Let me respond by also trying to answer Masha's question about the relationship between the concepts of loneliness and the elimination of space between men, which I think I've already touched on a little bit, but I'll add to it with responding to Howard's question, which I think is, to me, one of the most important questions of our time. So there are three realms that Arendt talks about in her book, The Human Condition, in which human beings, interact. And I want to just say these three realms are not mutually distinctive. You often are, at almost all times, you're in more than one. So these are ideas, but they're not iron boxes. So one is the private realm, right? So the private realm is where you can be unique and different and pluralist, and it's where it's where a kind of human plurality in its, where we learn to be unique and different and eccentric and And so the private realm is both, in her sense, a kind of privation, because in being private, you're isolated and you're cut off from political activity, which is part of what it means to be human. But a vibrant private realm for her is absolutely necessary in order for people to grow up and to be independent and self-thinking. Then there's the public realm, which is where you act publicly and do so in a way that is surprising and spontaneous and free. Between them is this strange and one of the most difficult things to understand in her work, thing called the social. And the social is, on the most easy way to describe it, it's sort of where we hang out with people we like. So if we're Jews and we want to go to the Neverly Lodge up in the Catskills, the social is, we go and socialize where we want to people. Or if we're Muslim and we want to have a Muslim school and we want to be educated with other Muslims, we go to a Muslim school to be educated. These are for her social rules where we choose to hang out with whom we want to choose to hang out with and be with. But the social is also this overarching world of conformity in which we increasingly demand that we not only have political equality, right, that we can all, in our pluralistic and different ways, engage, but we demand that we have a kind of economic and social equality where we are all the same, which means that we must condemn and even repress and even criminalize our different opinions and different eccentricities. And this demand for conformity in the social realm for her is a root of totalitarianism. What you're talking about, Howard, is, in my opinion, and I think this is Arendtian reading, the rise of two completely different totalitarian social worlds, one on the left and one on the right, that are increasingly increasingly totalitarian in their claim that any deviance in private or in public is to be punished, reprimanded, and extinguished. And we are creating a situation in which the closed conformity of both of these worlds is so extreme that they can't really talk to each other. And now, let me say, I don't think that's completely the case. I think there are still places where people in these two worlds can talk to each other, and the Arendt Center has committed itself to being one of those places. We are desperately trying to hold conferences and lectures and events in which we bring people from these two worlds together to have civil, meaningful conversations. And the fact that we can still do this is promising, although I will tell you the amount of vitriol that we are being subjected to for trying to do it right now, which is the reason I've been so busy in emergency meetings this week, is depressing and disheartening and really painful. But it is an attempt, and I don't think we're the only place it's happening. But if there's one thing in our current world that Arendt's book teaches me, it's the need to resist the social totalitarianism on both the left and the right that we are currently experiencing. The elimination of spaces that Masha asks about and that Arendt talks about here is the claim that everyone must think the same, and that it's not enough for you simply to act the same. You must think the same, right? I mean, one of one of the examples that to me really illustrates this, and some of you may have heard me talk about this before, and I apologize, is this event that happened a couple of years ago when the owner of one of the basketball teams out west, named Donald Sterling, I believe, who was an older white man and was dating a biracial younger woman, and the biracial younger woman was hanging out with African American basketball stars. And I guess some of the older white man's friends complained, and he called her up on the phone and said, "Look, I don't care what you do with these African Americans. You can sleep with them," he says, "for all I care, but my friends don't like it, so please don't publicize it." And she then recorded that conversation and made it public, and he was forced to sell the team. That's a very interesting question. So here's a situation in which a man is, for a private conversation with his girlfriend, which she decided to publicize, which is a questionable decision, is said to be publicly unfit to own a basketball team. This is a kind of social and enforced conformity. Now, there's no doubt what he said is offensive and racist. Although, I mean, it was interesting to think how he said it. But the point, I guess what I want to say is the question it raises is, to what extent should we be policing people's private lives? To what extent, when somebody to their girlfriend or boyfriend or partner says something in confidence, does that expression of an opinion, which we might find offensive, invalidate their public life? And we are increasingly living in a world in which we are saying that if someone does something in private that is considered against our social conventions, we find that to be invalidating them publicly, and they have to, in a sense, retract, retrench, and, in a sense, come on board. And we have created a world in which it is not only unacceptable to act against convention, but it's unacceptable to think and speak in private against convention. And we need to think that is what I think she means by the elimination of space between men. There's no private space anymore. And with the increase of technology and surveillance, where we pretty much know that everything we do might be taped and is potentially hearable by the FBI, let alone our partners. We're now in a situation as college professors where we're told to not let students bring backpacks into meetings because they might have their phones on taping us. I mean, the loss of trust in academic situations is such that nobody feels safe expressing their opinion anymore. This goes back to the secret police. We've entered a realm in which everybody is now a potential surveiller, and therefore everyone who speaks knows that what they speak might be spread around the internet, might be publicized.
Infinite Stasi.
What? The infinite Stasi. That is what I think she means by the loss of space between people. That is what she means by loneliness. Does anyone? I mean, I'm happy to. I think what I've said is fairly controversial. I don't know. I think there's a lot of different things going on here, but I'm happy to have people. I mean, I think it's worthwhile topic for conversation if people want to respond to it.
I always agreed with you that immediately when that whole incident happened with the older man and his younger girlfriend, I really felt badly for him because he was an older man in some sort of compromising situation. He was embarrassed, he was shamed, and I didn't feel he warranted that treatment at all. So I agree with you that it was a private conversation that should have remained private.
Gary Patton, right? I'm just going to skip along to see if there's anything related to this. Gary Patton writes, without trying to pry, could you share with us the kind of problems you spoke of at the center as you to try to celebrate and facilitate the expression of different views? We're all members of the center, and I'm sure many of us would like to do anything we can to support the approach you have outlined, allowing and facilitating the expression and exchange of truly views. Your statements are controversial, I suppose, but I think you are on point. No disagreement, as I'm concerned as you are. Yeah, Gary. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but we have a couple of programs at the center. One is, well, first of all, I mean, the first thing I should say is some of you may know that Charles Murray has become a lightning rod, and recently was banned by was disrupted by Middlebury students, and he's been prevented from speaking at another number of colleges. I'm sure some of you know, and some of you were there. We had Charles Murray on campus 2 years ago giving one of the keynote talks at our conference. It was a very popular talk. I'm very glad we did it, but we took a fair bit of heat for that. But we have two new programs. One is called Tough Talks, where it's a student-led group. They're doing a fantastic job, and I want to just recognize one of our students who's leading the group, Mark Williams, Jr. But we bring controversial speakers to campus who bring viewpoints that are often very much at odds with the view of the campus community, in order to try and generate reflection and dialogue on campus. Just last night, we had a woman named Suzanne Venker speaking on campus. She's written 5 books, and she argues, and she's sort of an anti-feminist in a way, although she's a very strong and accomplished woman, and argues that women should not be trying to emulate men in having careers outside the home. She says if they want to, fine, but that feminism in a sense, devalues a core woman's value of having children and raising a family, and that women should have opportunities to do so within the home, and other arguments as well. We had a huge student crowd last night. It was probably the most well-attended and engaged lecture I've ever seen at Bard College. More questions, more student engagement than any other lecture I've seen. It was an enormous success, and I applaud the Bard students for treating it so seriously. A lot of students threatened to boycott the event, threatened to disrupt the event, and in the end, after explaining to them what we were doing, they came, they engaged, and it was an enormous success. And I just want to applaud them and applaud Suzanne Venker for coming. She had been disinvited from other performances in the past, and she was very wary of coming because she thought she would be treated badly, and I think it was a success. On the other hand, we've invited another person who's a Bard grad, who's on the alt-right, named Lucian Wintrich, and the students and the faculty at Bard have been very upset at this invitation. Luckily, we've headed off calls for disinvitation, but there is an enormous upset on campus and calls, and the Arendt Center has been censored by a number of groups on campus for bringing him. But luckily, again, we have the support of the administration. This may or may not happen now because Lucian Wintrich is now spreading lies on the internet that we disinvited him, which is untrue. And we've demanded an apology. And if he doesn't apologize and retract that statement, we will retract the invitation. I put so much effort into this, defending his right to speak. If he's then going to go around saying we disinvited him when we haven't, he's got to retract that publicly. So I've made that decision, and I sent him an email earlier today saying he has 72 hours to publish a public retraction, or we will withdraw the invitation. These are very complicated issues, but that's sort of what's going on, Gary.
Roger, I'd like to make a comment about something that Patrick posted about the role of determinism in the ideologies that have led to totalitarianism. And that is, I think that I agree. I think that determinism, the whole idea of determinism, which I link to the development of science and in the Western world, right, and the idea of progress, the idea that people are in continuous movement forward, that these really propel those ideologies. And I just want to remind myself that throughout human history, there have been alternative views, that is, views that are not linked to the idea of progress. There are ideas of history as a cycle or a series of cycles, the idea that man was born to suffer, which is still a very widely held idea, and that in the world today, we're looking at 7 billion plus people, many of whom may be living under tyrannical conditions, but whose outlook is not affected by that in the same way that they would be in the West, largely because of the persistence of these long-held ideas, which guide people through their lives. So, I think it's possible to be optimistic and pessimistic at the same time, which I try to do, and I try to apply the right one in the right place.
Thank you, Jack. Let me read Patrick's comment so people have it, and I'll then respond. I think it's a great point. So Patrick writes, the Darwinism and Marxism you speak of, or Arendt speaks of, reminds me of Karl Popper's view of the evil of determinism in general in open society and its enemies. The centrality of this idea to totalitarianism as a development of tyranny seems to me important. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap between Popper and Arendt, although obviously there's going to be differences. The idea of progress that Jack just mentioned is, I think, right. So these ideologies, Marxism and Darwinism, we can call it Marxism, historicism and racism, if you want to put it, those are the two dominant ideologies of the 20th century. And they're both progressive ideologies, right? I mean, Darwinist is the survival of the fittest. I mean, this is part of the left wing, or I don't want to call it the left wing. The ethical critique of Darwin has nothing to do with science. It has to do with the claim that the scientific motion he describes is progressive and thus positive and thus fit, and the survival of the fittest, which says that those groups that survive are the ones that deserve to have survived, right? And that is a morally questionable, I think, and morally outrageous view. And to the extent Darwin held it, which I think he did, it's a problem with Darwin's overarching writing, not the theory of natural selection. But certainly the social Darwinists who embrace it fully are part of this progressive racist view that needs to be addressed. And the Marxist view of class struggle and the progressive view of the rise of the proletarian dictatorship, which justifies violence and terror in the name of eventual freedom of the classes, is again a dangerous progressive view. You're right. Arendt's view is not progressive, and she is always worried about progressive views. To this extent, she is a tragic thinker, if you want to put it in those terms. And tragedy is not pessimism. I think Jack expressed that in his own way when he said that there's both optimistic and pessimistic ways to read this. You know that the newsletter we send out every week is called Amor Mundi. Amor Mundi, which means for the love of the world, is Arendt's response to the tragic view of the world, which is that what tragedy does in the Greek conception of tragedy is to beautify and ennoble the recurring horror of human existence. And thus, it is to affirm the world amidst its horror. And that, she says in numerous entries in the early 1950s in her diary, that is the hardest thing it has been for her as the survivor of the Holocaust to do, to affirm and love the world amidst its horrors. And she says that is what she thinks she's accomplished, is to do that. And that is what her writing is an attempt to do. So it's an attempt to affirm tragedy, to affirm the beautification and reconciliation of the world amidst its horror, not denying its horror, looking its horror head on, and yet affirming the world as nevertheless good. And so that is the alternative to a progressive view of the world, which insists that we will, in a sense, be successful in remaking the world, and we will justify any means to do so. Kat writes that I thought it was interesting that this chapter holds up spontaneity, an essential human expression, rather than liberty or free thought or political engagement or something else. Why is spontaneity so important for her? That's a great question, Kat. Again, in her second book, or her next book, The Human Condition, which in many ways is a sequel to this book. If we go back to chapter 9 on the end of the rights of man, right? And we recall what she said, which is that we need a new law on earth, a new law of human dignity. And she doesn't know if that can happen, but that's what we need. And what she says is the only truly human right is the right to act and speak in public in ways that matter. And that means to belong to a public community in which you can act and speak in ways that matter. That is what she means by human freedom. And to go back to what we just said about privacy, so the social and the public, to be free means to do something spontaneous, to do something that is not expected. And if you want to act, and by action she means action together with others in ways that matter in public. To act means for her to do something that is unexpected, shocking. Because if you do something that people expect, right, they don't pay attention to you. I mean, this is the problem with protest in politics today. If you protest, the police come, they cordon off the street. It has no impact. But if you then want it to have more of an impact, so you shut down the street and you break the law, they arrest you and they let you go. The point is, protest has become unsurprising. And the only way to make protest meaningful is to make it ever more surprising, to up the ante, to be ever more unlawful, to be ever more confrontational. And that, of course, risks making the protest unpopular with the majority. But spontaneity. And so you have the most interesting development in this world, in my view, are these new collectives, the Activism Collectives, that seek to hand out flowers or give Cokes or Pepsis or whatever it is. I don't understand exactly what's going on to people. But what they're trying to do is find ways of engaging in public action that are surprising and spontaneous, such that people talk about them and respond to them because they're new. And that's what spontaneity means for Arendt. It's something that comes from a thought that must happen in private, where you think something original and new and then insert it into the world. And so spontaneity is for her the very essence of freedom, because freedom means to act in such a way that is unexpected so that people have to respond. And that's what spontaneity is. Kat, does that make sense to you? Do I need to say more? So Ron asks, it seems to me that it is not hard to see how capitalist ideology functions in our society in a quasi or pre-totalitarian form. Positive laws are largely enacted for the sake of economic growth and growth of economic activity, and production probably is based on economic laws, which are taught and believed as true as physical laws. Arendt clearly analyzed this in the Soviet socialist Marxist form. Did she anticipate in its contemporary neoliberal form so dominant our society now? Yeah, I mean, I think so. So first of all, she sees capitalism and socialism as very similar in a couple of respects. For her, the real they both deprive us of freedom. So socialism deprives us of freedom for her by in a sense saying we're this social body and we must follow these laws of history and we must submit to a kind of government bureaucracy which is going to implement things. And capitalism deprives us of freedom insofar as it creates a division of income which makes people so miserable that they lose their freedom. It's worth noting that she makes a distinction which you may find either enlightening or repulsive between poverty and misery. And what she says is that people who are poor are still free. People who are miserable are no longer free. And I think one of the interesting questions that she raises is to what extent we should think about this distinction between poverty and misery. She makes this distinction in the book On Revolution, which may be a book worth reading at some point. The other thing she says about capitalism is that the logic of modern capitalism, and by the way, also the logic of modern socialism, in the end is for her consumerism. It is what it does is it imagines that we labor not in order to free ourselves from need so that we would have time to act politically or be artists or think, but we labor in order to consume, and then we need to labor more in order to consume. And she says that one of the great mistakes Marx made is that he thought that socialism would lead to a situation in which men had a basic enough so that they could go fishing or pursue hobbies, but that the opposite has happened, that when we lead to a situation in which people have enough, they want more and they just labor more. And so it is this it is the elevation of labor and consumption to the highest activities of capitalist modern man that she says denies the promise of, in a sense, social democracy. So, Ron, do you want to respond to that, or anyone? That the chapter on consumerism is in the end of the section on labor in the human condition. Since you're all members, you can go and watch my discussion of that in the virtual reading group sections on the human condition, and happy to talk about it as well.
Well, I think that discussion leads to a question, which is whether people would prefer to live under the dictates of 100 families or the dictates of an uncontrolled bureaucracy out of control.
Yeah, I mean, there's different structures, there's different, things that there's many in between, but yeah. There's a question from Zephyr. I've been thinking a lot about the rule of law and what it means. As I think we all are these days. And what the relationship of Trump to law means. On the one hand, he refers regularly to law and appeals to law and the rule of law. On the other hand, he seems to be dismissive of law. I don't have a particular question so much as being curious about how you think Trump does or does not reflect any or some of the ideas related to totalitarianism and its relationship to the law and the rule of law. Okay, that's a very good and complicated question. So, in the end, I guess the end first. What most disturbs me about the president is his embrace of people like Bannon and Flynn, who I believe are willing to ditch the law and ditch restraints in the name of a movement. What most reassures me about the president is his elevation of people like General Mattis, and I think the name is, the new National Security Advisor, and people like Tillerson, who I do believe are deeply committed to government within laws. I think Trump's embrace of himself as the leader of a movement is in irreconcilable tension with his imagination of himself as someone committed to American values, whatever they are. The best thing that's happened in the last 70 some odd days is the firing of Flynn and the apparent loss of power of Bannon and the rise of, I think, what we might call the center in Trump's cabinet.
Roger, may I just say one thing? May I just interject for a second?
Yeah.
To use the Nietzschean phrase, he thought he was going to rule by triumph of his will. And I think his big shock was to learn almost right off the bat that the courts were ready to step in and deny him that. And I think that from then on, he's been living under a less of an illusion that he's going to be the ultimate ruler through will and not law.
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. I don't know. I try and refrain from saying what I think he thought because I don't know what he thought. But I don't disagree with you, Barry. I think that Trump always offered contradictory statements and views on this. I think he's been frustrated. I believe you're right. But I think we also have to give him some credit for appointing people like Mathis and Tillerson and I forget what the fellow from the National Security Council's name is, and other people like them. I do believe these are good and honest people. I may not agree with them politically, but I find them to be good and honest people. And I think that you can't say that wasn't part of who he was and what he was looking at. I do believe.
He refers to them as my military.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting point. I look at, the military is if you look at the terrible poll numbers for the police, justified, Congress, more than justified, the president, even more than justified. The only institution left in this country that actually has positive poll numbers is the military. That's a scary and yet interesting observation of the polls. And, one of the things I think we can say about the military is it's probably the most racially diverse and racially just institution in our country. And it's probably the one most committed to the rule of law. And as much as I dislike the idea of military government, and I do, and I'm not hoping that we get a military government, Trump's embrace of a number of military leaders is probably, to me, the potential saving grace of his administration.
Roger, I think that's also part of his authoritarianism. They're going to be generals who he loves because they're under his command. That's what he thought. His original thought was, these are my generals. And like Mad Dog, my Mad Dog, Mattis. I think that he is also happy over the fact that these days these guys are taking some charge. But I think that his original impulse, which may still be there, that he's going to rule by his will, may still be paramount in his mind, and that is dangerous.
Yeah, you're right. So let me say, I mean, the first thing Mad Dog Mattis did to Trump is say, I disagree with you about torture. And he stood up to Trump. And Tillerson has changed Trump's view on Russia. Again, all I'm saying is, so I do agree with you that his embrace of the military has an authoritarian streak. And the biggest worry I have, and one I've expressed numerous times here and in writing, is what happens after a major terrorist attack. I could easily see a claim that, look, we know how to write this, and we're going to run it, and we're going to take away some civil rights. But as much as I think that you could experience a rise in authoritarianism, I do not believe that the current cabinet would accede to the kind of totalitarian impulses that I think are on the other side of Trump's wish list with Bannon and Flynn. We may disagree. I don't know. I'm trying to be as fair to them both as I can. Maybe that's not fair. Zephyr, did I
Can I
answer?
interrupt for just a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
I need to say to you that if you have actually experienced life in the military, which some of us have, you will find that the description of lack of freedom that you find in the works of Hannah Arendt is given great life in the military. You are free to do nothing. And for all the positive things you can say about the military as an institution, that is, I agree with you, the most racially diverse, et cetera. In terms of the life of the individual within the military, there is no such thing. They are mere counters in a game.
So let me say, I think that I haven't been in the military. I'm making a distinction between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And I don't believe the military is totalitarian, although I do believe it's authoritarian. For good reason, it's a hierarchical group. But there's no claim in the military that you can't think what you want. You just have to act a certain way, as far as I understand it. And the freedom
depends on your rank.
Yeah, maybe it depends on your rank, but no, I mean, but the fact that the military does promote and free thinkers like Mattis and others, to me, is some evidence of that. But
Roger?
yes,
I want to get back to Zephyr's question.
please.
It seems to me that the question of law is what is it that the law seeks to protect? And what I'm driving at there is what aspect of the human condition is prioritized by any particular set of laws or any particular law. And to me, that's where the tension between law and justice comes into play. And I think it's an interesting topic. I don't know if it fits into the book, but it's certainly one that I'm concerned with.
Well, it fits into the book. I mean, Arendt discusses it in this chapter we just read today. And she talks about how typically law is related to justice insofar as law is positive law, but positive law is supposed to be an expression of some higher justice. So this is on page 462 to 463. The difference is that the justice that positive law traditionally was supposed to be an expression of was a kind of universal, divine, or natural justice. There was a kind of stability to it. It was a world. It was a world that was accessible to people through religion or tradition in some way, and because it was somewhat stable, it created a sense that the justice system had a kind of stability to it, and it was reined in by a publicly accessible, understandable world as it is. totalitarianism, insofar as it turns the justice that laws aim at into a progressive, unending demand, eradicates that stability and thus deprives people of any sense of knowing what the law is at any time. And therefore, you can be arrested and criminalized for doing things that yesterday were completely acceptable. And that's the move from an idea of law based on what I call in my book, The Gift of Science, a kind of insight into what is, and an idea of law that is based into a scientific, pseudo-progressive, pseudo-scientific movement. Clearly we can get the laws wrong, even in a system of non-totalitarianism, and that's what politics is about: who gets to write the laws that reflect the common insight into what is just. But generally, there's a general agreement among most people about the need for justice and sort of what justice is. I mean, if you look at the difference between Republicans and Democrats, they all think, justice should be about freedom and equality. They disagree on the details of what freedom and equality are. But, if you actually get them together in a room, there's a lot they agree on. They just disagree on things. And when they don't talk to each other, those disagreements become, set and extreme. So I take that to be the difference. Any other thoughts on this point? So Susan recommends The Circle, which is the Eggers novel. I have to admit I haven't read The Circle, although I've wanted to. And we had this big conference on why privacy matters 2 years ago at the Arendt Center, and a number of the talks addressed this idea of surveillance. All those talks are available online. And for those of you who are members at the, I think it's the $100 or up level, you should have received volume 4 of the Arendt Center Journal recently. And it publishes many of those lectures, which are on this question of surveillance and transparency. Another book I'd recommend on this matter is David Brin's book on surveillance, which is sort of extraordinary. Patrick writes, one of the most difficult realities we all must face is that fact that superfluity, Aristotle's beggars and slaves and workers and child soldiers of the Democratic Republic of Congo, I assume, and ghosts on the Johannesburg street is a Malthusian Gordian knot. I'm sorry, Patrick, you're going to have to explain a Malthusian Gordian knot to me. I apologize. I know I should know it. Anyone want to explain to me a Malthusian Gordian knot? Rhea writes, Roger, would you comment on loneliness with regards to Sherry Turkle's work on social media? Yeah, I mean, first of all, I also recommend Sherry Turkle's talk at the Arendt Center from our conference, Human Being in a Human Age. I mean, Sherry Turkle to me is one of the most absolutely essential writers on these questions we have. Her argument is that, especially among young people, the turn towards immediate texting and living their life in a kind of immediate social media means that, whereas traditionally, when something happened, an event that we had to respond to, we thought about it and then talked about it with a person. Now, the way teenagers on social media act, and she's an anthropologist who studies the way teenagers act, her argument is that when something happens, they immediately, before they think about it, post it and begin what she calls a public sort of development of a common answer. They're not trying to develop their own opinion. They're trying to figure out what themselves as a social network think. And she sees this as a situation in which the speed of communication and the social networked idea of communication is taking away the traditional approach of first thinking about one's own opinion, or maybe developing an opinion in a conversation with one friend, and this groupthink development of a common opinion. And so her research into how teens come up with responses to things that emerge in their lives is sort of right on target with much of this work. It's one of the reasons, and I've thought a lot about this, and I don't think there's any good answers to it, but it's one of the reasons that I've tried to suggest that while we should, of course, never censor certain technologies, I don't believe that at all. It may be really important to publicly restrict the amount of the use of certain technologies for children, or at least encourage people to do that. I do think, as a parent, that networked children is a disaster, a moral, ethical, and psychological disaster for students, for young people. They have to learn to think on their own before they know how to use something where they are connected with others. And it's something we've struggled with, and I'm struggling with. But I think one of the potential public conversations we need to have, just like we regulate cigarettes and alcohol and other things for children, is social networks for children. I think they're incredibly dangerous. I'm not presenting a policy presentation. I don't have one. I'm not a policy thinker. But to me, it's an absolute danger to free thought in our society. Yeah, Ray, I'm happy to hear you. I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think Sherry Turkle is very important. Ron asks, however, with limits of growth so evident ecologically, the conversation has changed from when she wrote, no doubt. I think the preference of people to indulge in ever-increasing consumption in opposition to living lives that makes freedom a priority is not unlike what Dostoevsky talked about in The Grand Inquisitor. Absolutely, and she cites The Grand Inquisitor frequently in her work. It's one of the more important aspects of one of the more important examples she'll use. And it stands exactly for that most people, most of the time, would rather have bread than freedom, right? And that therefore it is the job of others to keep the idea of freedom alive in society. So a lot of what she talks about, and this is again a place she's often criticized, sometimes for being an elitist, which I think is an unfair criticism. What she says is not that there should be an elite that governs, but what she says is that throughout history, it has never been the case that most people want to be free. In fact, all evidence suggests the opposite, right? Based on the Grand Inquisitor and others, that most people at most times would prefer consumption to freedom. And so what she says is there are, however, always people who prefer freedom to luxury or consumption. And those, she says, are not an inborn aristocracy and not the wealthy at all, but she says they're the political elite. They're the people who over time show themselves to prefer freedom and collective action in politics to other rewards, and that they should be the people who are increasingly politically in charge. And so she thinks that it is important to empower that political elite over and against bureaucracies and over and against a social elite. And because she speaks of the word elite, people accuse her of being elitism. But from her, it's a ground up elite that comes from people who prove themselves adept at and in love with political freedom. Yeah, Trump has defined war making. Obviously, war and the pursuit of war can change things greatly. I'm very aware of that. I guess Ron Engel writes, I guess I'm the leftist here. Our military program has been in the service of American economic market advance for more than the rule of law. In fact, we have been retreating from international law and from our own constitutional responsibilities with regard to war, peace decisions for some time. And under Trump, it seems he is only expanding this. I'm not going to dispute that, Ron. Again, this is one of the, what shall we say, internal contradictions of Trump. I mean, he ran as an isolationist in some way. I mean, he talked about getting rid of and out of international entanglements and out of, international events. And in many ways, he was the most anti-imperialist candidate outside of Ron Paul and Rand Paul that we've had ever. And yet he also has this warlike other side of him. And, this is one of those situations in which I think the wrong side of Trump is victorious over the right side of Trump. What his actual beliefs are, I have no idea. And he's one of the most enigmatic. And I think that's part of his plan, is to say so many things that nobody knows actually what he has in mind. But I'm simply offering an untutored opinion there, so I should shut up.
Probably obviously a bully, and I think that really explains to a certain extent his delight in dropping bombs.
I mean, he's a bully is, I think, uncontroversial. Without a doubt. I mean, so to go back to a little thing, I mean, one of the reasons I invited this man, Lucian Wintrich, to be on a panel, by the way, not to give a talk on his own, but to be on a panel about how to speak with people we disagree with, is because as a member of the alt-right media and as a self-professed political artist and political troll, he actually, in my mind, represents the method of the Trump administration. And while some people suggest that we should ignore that and not allow it on our campus, my view is that the only way to learn to respond to power is to encounter it, understand it, and thus learn how to resist it. And so that's why I invited him to campus. And it has caused an enormous backlash, and we'll see what happens. I see there's a lot of comments that have shown up. David writes, we have been ignoring the effects of militarism for a generation. The time is soon to arrive when we'll need to oppose war making. You may very well be right, David. And I think, as I gave a talk on, as some of you know, on 1984, the movie recently, and I said what I've said in a number of public forums recently is, I think it's important to not be hysterical and not say Trump is totalitarian or fascist when he's not yet. But there may be a time when that becomes our responsibility, and when we need to not just say things, but to put ourselves on the line in some meaningful way. And I think it's absolutely imperative, and I hope one of the benefits of this group, and I hope you guys will find it to be such, is that what Arendt helps us do is not say Trump is a totalitarian or Trump is a tyrant, because I don't think he is right now, but helps us to give us the critical thinking skills to ask ourselves when the line is crossed. And let's hope the line doesn't get crossed, but we should all be, I think, thinking about what happens when that line is crossed and how we'll respond.
My comments there were about an earlier conversation, so you can skip them. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We're out of time, but I'm going to read Suzanne's comment. I'm going to see what it says. It says, I hope that before we close today, we attend to those final words of this amazing book. This is a happy ending, and I would like to better understand and embrace it. Okay, that's great. Let's close with that. Let's look at the happy words. Starts on 478, and I'm going to read it. Starts with in the middle of the page. The conditions under which we exist today in the field of politics are indeed threatened by these devastating sandstorms. I think sandstorms, which she's talked about, are an interesting use. She's making a distinction between the desert of isolation and tyranny and the sandstorms of totalitarianism, where it gets in every fiber of your body. Their danger is not that they might establish a permanent world, right? So totalitarianism can't be permanent in her view because it, in the end, is so fictional that in the end it can't keep itself alive. Totalitarian domination, like tyranny, bears the germs of its own destruction. Just as fear and the impotence from which fear springs are anti-political principles and throw men into a situation contrary to political action. So for those of you who don't know and would like to know, this is a reference to Montesquieu. Montesquieu's three forms of government, republicanism, monarchism, and tyranny, have three different principles. Principle of republicanism is virtue, of monarchy is honor, and of tyranny is fear. And so here she's saying that fear is the principle of tyranny. So just as fear and impotence are anti-political principles, so loneliness, which is the new, she's in a sense arguing that there's a fourth form of government that Montesquieu could not have known of, which has its own principle, right? Loneliness. So loneliness and the logical, ideological deducing the worst that comes from it represent an anti-social situation. It's not just anti-political, but it also isolates us not just politically, but socially. And that's the difference between loneliness and isolation. An anti-social situation and harbor a principle destructive for all human living together. Nevertheless, here's where we begin the happiness. Nevertheless, organized loneliness is considerably more dangerous than the unorganized impotence of all those who are ruled by the tyrannical and arbitrary will of a single man. Its danger is that it threatens to ravage the world as we know it, a world where everywhere seems to have come to an end. Aha! Before a from this end has had time to assert itself. That's the new beginning. And this is, again, part of Arendt's entire philosophy, that no matter what happens, human freedom, human spontaneity, the capacity to begin again, what she calls once or twice natality, always offers the opportunity for a new beginning. Apart from these considerations, which as predictions are of little avail and less consolation, there remains the fact that the crisis of our time and its central experience, loneliness, have brought forth an entirely new form of government which has a potentially and ever-present danger, is only too likely to stay with us from now on. Just as other forms of government which came about at different historical moments and rested on different fundamental experiences have stayed with mankind regardless of temporary defeats, monarchies and republics, tyrannies, dictatorships, and despotism. But there remains also the truth that every end in history necessarily contains a new beginning. Again, a new beginning. This beginning is the promise, the only message which the end can ever produce. Beginning, before it becomes a historical event, is the supreme capacity of man. Politically, it is identical with man's freedom. Initium ut esset homo creatus est. That a beginning be made, man was created, said Augustine. This beginning is guaranteed by each new birth. It is indeed every man. So this is a mantra that Arendt offers in many of her books. This return to this sentence of Augustine's. The idea here is that Augustine says man is a beginner. He is someone who can initiate. And because of that basic idea of man as free, as beginning, as spontaneous, it is, as long as there are men in the world, freedom and new beginnings are possible. And that is the, I think, rightly hopeful view. If you want to end on a pessimistic note, what's called the Transhumanist Movement, right? The attempt to make man into cyborgs and regulate man through implants that will make him ever more rational and predictable, raises enormous questions for the Augustinian Arendtian claim that man is a beginner and is free. So too does the rise of a network society where we, in a sense, give up our individual freedom to become, in a sense, networked beings. These are the dangers that we now see rising in the technological hatred of man's freedom, insofar as man's freedom leads to inefficiencies and errors and irrationalities and the desire to correct man. Arendt is deeply afraid that the technological demand to make man reliable and rational threatens the very essence of human freedom as a beginner. And that is the great threat that I think she understood to humanity today. But so far, we're still beginners and we're still free. And let's end on that note.